Hey guys, it's Patrick. This is going to be our Bible class for March 25th for the Odom Church of Christ. And, I just want you guys to know that we miss you. I know some of you we got to see Sunday, some of you it's been a while. And I think we can all agree that while we're excited about the new technology and everything that it has in it, we also long to be together again. And so we're praying for that, and hopefully that will be soon and we can do it safely. And just know that we are praying for you guys, and we appreciate the prayers that you have for us, and then we'll get through this together the best we can. That being said, we have a Bible class tonight, and I have introduced, or I'm going to introduce my friend here. For those who may not know him or may not remember him, this is Dewayne Bryant. Dewayne should be familiar with, for many of you, Dewayne has come and he did a gospel meeting for us several years ago. Also, for those who followed us on the podcast, we had a podcast together for like a year and a half, 2 years maybe. And so we go back a little bit. I remember meeting Dewayne. I'm not supposed to touch my face, and I've already done it. I remember meeting Dewayne at PTP years and years and years ago. And then when he came to Texas, I was really excited about that, and we've been friends ever since. For those who don't know, Dewayne is the pulpit minister at the New York Avenue Church of Christ. Did I get that right?
Mm-hmm.
And he also is a very studied guy. He has a background in archaeology, and he's known mainly for his knowledge of Egyptian archaeology, especially. I guess we would say that. Is that fair? A fair assumption? Is that fair to say there?
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. So
I'll take it.
Yeah, we're gonna try it. So I thought what we would do is, because hey, it's not every day I get Dewayne on the video chat like this. So now that I have his special skill set available to us, I was going to look over some stuff from the Old Testament. We're going to specifically look this evening at the 10 Commandments, which I thought would be, just an interesting study. And to be honest with you, we had sort of planned on this being a one-time classroom kind of thing where we just kind of go through all the commandments. But as we got things together, I don't think it's going to take one class. We may have to move this into two. So what we had planned to do is basically you can break up the 10 Commandments or the Decalogue into two parts. The first part deals with man's relationship with God. There are instructions for that. The last part is man's relationship with one another. And so we were going to deal with that first part this evening as we go through it. Okay, so Dewayne, you ready to get started, man?
Yeah, man, absolutely.
Okay, so let me start off. I'll just start with the section of scripture, Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 and 2. It said, "And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage." And I think there is, if you would look at it, you might almost skip over these first few words. And God spoke all these words, because we're used to the Bible telling us God speaks this, or God says this, or that kind of thing. But this is a really unique and special situation. The people have assembled at Mount Sinai. Moses is there with them. In Exodus chapter 19 and verse 19 tells us that he answered them specifically by voice. And so Moses is with the people, and they hear God's voice, and the reaction is utter terror. They from this point on, they don't want to listen or to hear, is probably the better way of saying it, to hear the voice of God. They're just frightened of it. And so from this point on, they ask Moses, after this, you go and you be our messenger for it. And, I think about, we read the Bible, and of course we think of scripture being God breathed and the idea that it comes from the mouth of God, but this actually did. And the response that they had is one of reverence and fear. And I wonder if maybe we shouldn't, as we read the Bible, have more of that same attitude, be more like them as they recognize this was the voice of God. And as we read the Bible and we say this is the voice of God. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're exactly right. I think the added dimension of actually hearing God's voice, I guess it's kind of a prompt or a reminder that, yeah, that's really him.
Right.
Although in the New Testament age, we have scripture, a complete collection of all of his revelation that he wanted us to have. And that should be enough. But sometimes it's like, we behave kind of like children. We need that extra incentive, that extra reminder to
Right.
actually take our responsibility seriously. And the Israelites have that. But I think you're right. We should just sort of instinctively understand that when we carry a Bible around, that's God's words there and scripturated.
Right. Okay. So let's move on. He says he's the Lord your God. He says, I brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, which again is to me is an interesting thing, because I might, in this moment where the voice is booming and the people are cowering, I might bring up the fact that, hey, I'm the creator of the universe. Like that's the God that I am. I'm the creator of the universe. I'm majestic and all, but he uses this particular qualifier that he brought them out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. As I thought about it, one, it was relevant to them. That's how they would know him at this particular moment. He was the God that brought them out. But it also, I think it shows he cared about them specifically. I brought you out of Egypt. You mean enough to me for me to bring you out of here and to sort of deliver you from, or to deliver you from this land, and to have this relationship with you. And so, I think it's probably something worth noting. I know also it might kind of hint into the idea that man desires freedom from bondage, and so maybe there's some appeal to that. You're going to be free, and I'm the one who's freeing you. And then it also reminds me of God. If you think of God as a liberator, he liberates me from sin through the sacrifice of his son today. And so with the same affection that we would expect the Israelites to respond to this particular statement, I brought you out of slavery, I brought you here into freedom. Again, it directly relates to us, and the idea that, hey, he did the same thing for us, and with the same appreciation, we should have that relationship as we approach God. Now, he does use the phrase house of bondage, because I think Israel has a tendency to romanticize Egypt a little bit after they've come out. I know in Exodus chapter 16 and verse 3, they talk about having pots of meat and stuff like that. Like we had food to eat in Egypt, and now we're out here and we're going to starve to death. And it's the manna comes from that. That's where this, the whole manna thing, it takes place. And then I think of it specifically in Numbers 11:5, where they said, we remember the fish that we ate freely in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melon, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. And to us, I think, well, that's kind of a weird thing to hold on to, but it just seemed like they tended to romanticize Egypt. And so I guess one point that we would make in that is that freedom affords us that idea. Once you've separated from something, you have then the opportunity to look back fondly at it. You know what I mean? And forget sort of the horrors that were taking place, the slavery and the labor and all of that they had gone through, and how they had cried out to God. Now separated from it a little bit, they might tend to romanticize it. But, and this is where you come in, Egypt's an impressive culture. I mean, they're wandering around in a desert, and the place that they'd come from, by their standards, was pretty spectacular, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, they had pretty impressive advancements for the ancient world, and they had genuine attempts at medicine.
Right.
Even later on, when people wanted a doctor, they wanted an Egyptian doctor. It's kind of like Harvard Medical School of the ancient world.
Right.
And they had the pyramids, they had all kinds of building projects, they had really a very developed, very impressive culture. And so there's no wonder why they would kind of look back to that and kind of imagine what life could be like because of what they saw with their neighbors. But at the same time, I mean, come on, in Exodus 16, it's like, hey, we had all you can eat buffets
Right.
nonstop, and
Right.
that's not how it worked, bro.
Right. Right.
So,
No, it's definitely, they have changed and it's switched, and they have gone from the glory and the glamour of Egyptian life and existence, and now they're basically living in survival mode. They're
mhm.
they're hungry and wanting their next meal, and so God has to introduce the manna, and then eventually that's not enough, and so the quail that comes in. Um, and I also think maybe as we look at that, that there is a sense in which God wanted them to remember their humble beginnings, um,
Mhm.
because for a little country, Israel has a pretty significant impact on the world. I mean, I've never been there. I know you have, but it's not that big a country, is it?
No, it's actually pretty small. I want to say it's about the size of New Jersey.
Yeah. So, I mean, you take this little country, and I know it was significant in the way that it was placed. It basically separated Asia and Asia Minor and all of that from Egypt and Alexandria and all of its stuff. And so you'd have to pass through there to get to one of those, and it was an important corridor. But even after that, I mean, you just look at history, um, and influence and things like that. And even today, Israel still has a significant influence on the world around it. I mean, we worry about Israel a lot. It's in the news all the time. We talk about their elections and the struggles that are going on there with the religion and political and all that. I mean, we still think about it quite a bit. Um, and I think part of what has to happen is that God wanted them to remember at one point you were slaves. Remember where you came from. And remember, even though you might be at a place of significance, and certainly in the days of Solomon and David, they would reach kind of the height of their glory. Um, but remember where you came from. And
Mhm.
I immediately, as I have that thought, I think about Shema, Deuteronomy chapter 6. Uh, when you have all this stuff, when you're in these cities that you didn't build and the vineyards that you didn't plant and all that, beware lest you forget God. And then he says it again, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Remember where you came from. And again, I keep thinking back to us, Dwayne. Where did we come from as those who were defined by sin to where we are now? And there's got to be some humility to that, to know that at one point I was in a place where, because of my own choices, I could not be saved. I could not save myself. Maybe that's the way I should have said. I couldn't save myself. I needed God. I needed the sacrifice of Christ to bring me out of that slavery, to bring me out of that bondage, and would also, I think, help to keep me from romanticizing it.
Mhm.
Of what was necessary to get me out of that. All right, Israel's. I mean, when you think about it, again, Israel's influence, Israel's significance can't be denied. But I don't think God wanted them to also deny their roots, their humble beginnings. Um, all right, so I've done a lot of speaking. You got anything you want to add to that, or are you ready to move on, man?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, here were people who, left to themselves, couldn't really do much of anything. And while it does kind of point to their humble origins, it also points to God's greatness, and that
Right,
He is he chooses. And I think Scripture even mentions this. There is nothing in them that should have been impressive or made God choose them. He chose them because He wanted to choose them, and He demonstrates His love and concern for them, even though they have done nothing to earn it. And so, while it emphasizes Israel's humble origins, it also underscores God's greatness.
right.
So,
And, I as you're saying that, I think about the whole principle of God using humbled things to do greatness, to do great things, and all the examples in the Bible you have, even Jesus himself comes from relatively humble beginnings. I mean,
mhm.
it was asked, any good thing come from Nazareth? And So when you look at all the flawed characters, the weakened characters, the individuals that struggled, but then yet also um, God was able to use them to do great things, it reminds me that I can have a significant impact on the world around me, even though I might be flawed and I might have things I struggle with. If I stick to doing things God's way and I stick to godly principles, that I can have that same influence, or I can have that same impact on the world around me.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's get into the next one. He says in verse 3, "You shall have no other gods before me." And again, I'm going to kind of go with the expert here, because Egypt had a bunch of gods, didn't they?
Yeah. I want to say they had like 3,000, about half of which we actually know the names for.
Right.
And so, just like any other culture in the ancient world, some of them had a lot of gods. Some of them might have had just one chief god, but they all worshipped multiple gods.
Right. And so I think sometimes we have a tendency when we look at this to think that maybe there's not a modern significance to this. You know what I mean? Like, um, we don't have a multiplicity of gods.
Mm.
There are, I mean, even if you want to look at some of the um, other religions that are out there, the non-Judeo-Christian based religions, even that it pales in comparison to what just Egypt had. And that doesn't also factor in some of the other cultures that would come later that had their own versions of these gods and their own gods that were part of that. And so I think maybe we look at this and we think about gods and false gods and things, and we think, well, it doesn't really, this is not really an us kind of thing. Yet I would argue that we do have a lot of false gods as a society. I mean, so when you think of the idea of a god, you think of something that you would structure your life around, something that takes significance, important, that you give time, effort, energy, devotion, love, and attention to, right?
Mm.
And so when you think about it, and I know this may make some people uncomfortable, but when you think about it, I mean, there are all kinds of things in our world that can become gods. Politics can become gods, or that becomes more important to us than New Testament Christianity, in our relationship with God. You have things like education and sports and hobby, and even relationships can become these sort of false gods that enter into our lives and that become objects of our devotion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they can distract and they can take away from our relationship with God. And that's something that we as Christians we struggle with, and we have to be diligent that we don't have any other gods in our lives. We don't have things that are taking our attention. And I remember years ago in preaching school, when this idea was introduced, I first I thought, well, that's kind of silly, and then the guy just used the example of sports, and he said, "Do you think about it? Um, Everyone has their favorite sporting team. That sporting team has its own temple. You go to the stadium. You have your own songs of worship and devotion where you sing the Eyes of Texas or whatever it is that song that you're singing. You have a priestly garb of colors that you put on and things like that." And I mean, and he kind of broke it down. You thought, I mean, there is a little bit of parallel to this when you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And then as you begin to look at the rest of your life, you can also see, well, there are these other things that could fall into that too. They could be just as distracting and just as consuming to our lives, and maybe try to take the place where God should be. Now, the Hebrew phrase here, "no other gods before me," if we read it in the English, we might think he's just talking about a line of succession here, like God's first, and then all these things have to fall in behind. But that's not really what the Hebrew phrase means. If I read it correctly, it's more of, don't put anything in front of my face. I don't want to see them. Don't have them, is maybe the way that we should put that. Don't bring them into my presence. I don't share the stage with anybody, so to speak, if you're talking about God. And In the same way, our lives, they shouldn't be in sight. We shouldn't have them here. Okay. He goes on to say no graven images, which again is in verses 4 in the first part of 5. You shall not make yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, that's in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down nor serve them. Certainly, this includes idols, but I think more importantly, it has to do with images of God Himself. And so the first question is, why would you make that rule? So having the graphic design background, I'm a very image driven kind of person, right? Images are moving to me. They can be important to me. And why wouldn't you want something that was a moving image of God who portrayed Him in such a way that maybe stirred emotions or something like that? I mean, we have movie posters where they show these figures that are larger than life and they look very heroic and all this kind of thing. And why wouldn't we present God that way? And then the more I thought about it, I also recognized that image sometimes gets confused with substance. And, I remember way back in I'm going to guess it's the 90s. It may have been the 80s. I'm not sure. But Andre Agassi, and he had a commercial where he said, image is everything. I think he was trying to sell a camera or something like that. But if you don't remember Andre Agassi, for those who don't remember, he was a tennis player. And he was kind of the rock and roll version of a tennis player in a time where everybody else was very conservative. He had long, spiky, kind of frosted hair, and wore different colors and things like that. He was sort of the splash of personality on the tennis circuit, and so he became known as the image guy. So that's why he's on there. But I also know that image can be manipulated and it can be controlled. And you can portray something as one thing when that's not necessarily the truth. You know what I'm saying? And so you can portray, some of these Marvel figures as these larger than life people, where the reality is they're not. They're just actors. Chris Hemsworth can't call down lightning from above, with his special hammer or anything like that. He's just a guy. But the image a lot of people have of him is this larger than life figure, this idea of him being Thor and things like that. That can all be manipulated. And you look at today, the way Jesus is portrayed, and it's manipulated. It's not the reality, because if I were to go by most of the pictures I see of Jesus, he's a white guy that's about 6'3" with blonde hair and blue eyes, kind of thin, a little effeminate, always kind of staring off into space or with a very sad look on his face or something like that. And that's kind of the picture that we get of Jesus, but that doesn't necessarily match the substance, does it?
Yeah. Well, that kind of speaks to I think the reasons why God didn't want these images made, because when you see an image, and this is from somebody who doesn't have a background in design or anything like that, but you see an image and it communicates a message, what does the picture says 1,000 words.
Right.
When you see the effeminate Jesus, or maybe like the one portrayed by Joaquin Phoenix, or whichever one was in The Last Temptation of Christ, it definitely has the look sends a message of its own. And for ancient Israel, this could have very well been the case, because images in the ancient world often included things that we could identify as very immoral. And once you start making those associations, theology kind of the message and the theology can kind of become interconnected. And so you have something like that about God or Jesus, and an image really says a lot more than sometimes we can say with words.
Right. I was reading a Jewish author who was making his commentary, and he had a line that says, the Torah is far more suspicious of the eye than the ear. And I also thought about 1 John 2:16, and the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. Visually, there is some danger in kind of what you're saying here, is because that can be a very powerful kind of thing. In Numbers chapter 15, God is giving them instructions about putting tassels on their garments, and you like put a blue thread in it, and and then he says in verse 39, you shall have the tassel that you may look upon it and remember all the commandments of the Lord and do them, and that you may not follow the harlotry to which your own heart and your own eyes are inclined. And so I thought it was interesting that he said, you're going to have these tassels that you may look upon them. Again, that sort of hints at the idea of what our eyes look at is important. What we take in visually is important. And so if we have this false picture of God or Christ that's out there, that it's going to affect us as we continue to look at it. And eventually what'll happen is, like you're saying, that image then becomes our sort of reality of how we look at it, right? Mm-hmm. One of the things that I also, as I was thinking about this, is I made the point, I wanted to make the point that men are creative, but we're not creators. And there's a difference between that. And so we tend to enhance what we already know. We even new ideas that we have are just ideas that are built off of other things. We've taken it when we've combined two things together. Like when I was a kid, Transformers were the big thing. It was such a brilliant idea. Transformers, it was a robot and a car, and they put them together. They didn't invent the robot, the idea of the robot. They didn't invent the idea of the car. They just invented the idea of putting these two things together. You know what I mean? And we saw that as, hey, that's a creative, wonderful thing. And as a kid, I loved it, and the Egyptian gods were kind of the same way. They were just enhancements of humanity, weren't they? But they were also pretty petty, weren't they?
Yeah, there are just unbelievably ridiculous stories
Right.
of things that happen about gods that kill other gods and do immoral things and do criminal acts, and just things that would be absolutely condemned if a human being did it.
Right. You read some of those stories and you're like, these are not gods. These are jerks, for lack of a better term. I mean, these are terrible, terrible beings that are, like we said, super petty and evil, and and again, it's just a reflection and enhancement of humanity. And in that, God is distinct from man. God is not an enhancement of man. He's not an echo of us. We're an echo of him. You know what I mean? We're a small glimpse of God and his nature, and it's not the other way around. You know what I'm saying? He's not a superimposed figure of us. We're a small reflection of him, and so he's distinct from man. He's not like creation. He's the creator, and there's definitely a difference between the two. And again, I think about Romans chapter 1, verse 22, where he talks about professing themselves wise, that became fools, and they worship the creature more than the creator. And so they got it backwards. They changed, to be precise, it says in verse 23, they changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man. They blurred that line between God, the creator, and the created. And there is a distinction between the two. And sometimes if we're building these false images and stuff, that tends to take that distinction away, because then God also becomes an extension of our imagination and what we know. And God is greater than that. Of all the collection of humanity's knowledge and creativity, God is outside of that. We are limited in our ability to depict God. And so, we have in the Bible, I think, his words that tell us about him and who he is, but we also recognize that they don't do God justice. The greatest lesson, the greatest sermon ever given, if words were picked just absolutely to perfection, would still fall short of describing the majesty of God. And the same thing is true with visual stuff too as well. And so you will make sure that you don't blur that line that God is created like everything else, because he's not. He's different. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, then we get to the last part of 5 and then the 6. It says, "For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children of the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands on those who love me and keep my commandments." So it uses the term here, God is a jealous God. And I saw where some have made the argument that maybe this word should be translated zealous more than jealous. But it's still the word that's there. Why does God use this particular term? Why the idea of jealousy, do you think?
Well, I think it underscores his love for his people. One of the things this is one of those things that people really criticize because we see jealousy as a very, very negative emotion, and the way
Right.
human beings do it. Yeah, I mean, when we get jealous, very often it's for over petty things, or it makes us do stupid things. And there's this totally infamous quote from Oprah where she said that she had a minister when she was living in Nashville and just kind of starting her career. So there was this minister who had talked about the attributes of God, and one of them was jealousy. And her response, I guess, as only a media personality could take it, was God jealous of me? And it's kind of like, no, Oprah, God's not jealous of you, honey. But she understood it in a very negative way, and that really undermined her view of God. And today, she's, who knows where she is. She's very kind of pantheistic. Who knows what, many paths to God kind of thing. But when we look at jealousy, and some people do say zealous because it does kind of remove that element of pettiness that jealousy often has. But I struggle with that because when you look at God's jealousy, think of human jealousy and then remove everything negative from it and just focus on the love and the relationship and the concern and the care that emotion has with none of the negative. And I think once you kind of purify it, then you're kind of getting closer to what God has for his people.
Right. I think there's also a sense in which the word's dumbed down for us. I mean, like the whole idea. So, I mean, I think we can all agree that God, his thoughts are not our thoughts, the Bible says. The entirety of God's wisdom is far surpassing that of man's. And so if God were to speak to us and with God's understanding, it would go over our heads. I remember several years ago, Branyan Mays, who is at World Video Bible School, shout out to them, and Rick Brumbach, both who are physicists, were talking, and I asked a question. It was when this boson particle came out, this, the God particle, whatever it was. And so I just asked the question, what is all of this? I didn't really understand it. Well, they got to talking, and after about 30 seconds, I just realized, yeah, I'm going to have to back out of this conversation. I have no idea what they're saying. They were speaking so far above my head because they're both super intelligent and they had both studied this particular subject and were familiar with it. And it meant nothing to me. And had God unfurled his wisdom on us on this subject in such a way that was to his level, I think we would have to be the same way. We would just, without comprehension, we wouldn't be able to accept it. And so he has to speak to us in our terms. He has to dumb it down for us in ways that we're going to understand. And almost like talking to a 2-year-old or, a small child, where you can't use large words and you can't use large, statements and principles and things like that. And so I think he uses this particular example in a way that we would understand. I don't understand the fullness of God's love for me, but I understand what it would feel like to be betrayed by someone you love. I can understand why my marriage relationship is so special to me and why I want to protect it. And how much it would hurt if that were violated or taken away. You know what I mean? And so it's a statement that I can at least sort of wrap my mind around. And sometimes it's not necessarily about God's pettiness as it is more about, I think, my lack of understanding the purity of God's love for me.
Mm.
And so he has to define it in these terms that they were faulted because we're looking at them from a humanistic side or humanity side, instead of being able to see it in the fullness of what it means coming from God. He then has the phrase there, the iniquity upon the fathers of children. The Bible clearly dismisses the idea of hereditary sin. Deuteronomy 24:16. He says the father shall not be put to death for their children, or shall children be put to death for their fathers. A person shall be put to death for his own sin. And then, of course, Ezekiel chapter 18 brings up this principle in verse 20. The soul who sins shall die. The son shall not bear the guilt of the father, or the father the guilt of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. Both of these remind us that the son, so back in those days, and maybe this is something you can help with, the son inherited everything, the passing down of the lineage, and it was more than just, hey, here's my stuff, right? Here's some of my stuff that I died and I've collected all this stuff, you get to have this stuff now. There was more to it than that, and an inheritance, wasn't there?
Yeah, well, I mean, there was a lot of shared responsibility, kind of community identity, I think, in the ancient world, where and maybe back in previous decades or even centuries in America and Europe. I mean, I think you might have something similar to that, where one person, what they did could taint the family for however long, whatever evil that they did. Somebody who committed a crime.
Right.
Well, his family bore the maybe not the judicial responsibility or culpability for the crime, but they did bear a stigma for it.
Right.
And I think something like this, it's very clear that there is, when it comes to sin, there is an individual responsibility that we all have
Right.
for ourselves.
Right. And I think that's the point I want to make, is that he's not saying that the children will bear the response to sin from God. In other words, they're not going to share the punishment for sin, but they are going to have to deal with the consequences of that sin. Having all that passed down to you, and having a family name, it's a reflection. You have a reflection in your own life of that entire deal. Like, so there have been people in the past who have been related to infamous people. You have, like, I know there was at one point, there was Osama bin Laden's brother, I think, was studying here in America after 9/11, and the stigma that just came with being associated with his name. Or maybe, let's say you found out you're a descendant of Hitler or somebody like that, or Benedict Arnold, or what. That name means something, and it kind of carries a stigma with it. And you have to deal with that. You didn't do it. You didn't, it wasn't your choice, but because you're a part of that family, it's going to affect you. And to me, I think there's a great lesson in that sin does affect more than just us. And that's one of the things when we talk about moral issues, and one of the dangers of alcohol doesn't just affect you. Yes, there are health consequences for alcohol and abusing alcohol and things like that, but it also affects families. It affects relationships. It affects other things that are going on in your life. And you take divorce. Divorce affects the two people who were married, but also when there are children involved, it affects those children. It affects, friends and family that are around you. It's not just, I just can't sin in a vacuum and it only affect me. It's going to affect other people. And I have to remember that, because like he's saying here, my sin, it carries on. It's going to affect more people than I actually realize it does. And so as a father, I need to think about how I act. As a friend, I need to think about how I act. As a minister, I need to think about how I act. As a Christian, I need to think about how I act. And um, just a reminder that our actions have enormous consequences. But I would also say this: there's another side to that. It has enormous benefits too. You can have a good reputation and be a person of integrity, and that also helps your children as they go on. They can also share in that legacy. You know what I mean? Okay. Now we get to using the Lord's name in vain, which, make sure I've got it right. Yeah. Exodus chapter 20 and verse 7. You shall not take the name of your Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. So, Dewayne, this is where the expert part of you comes in here. What is God's name?
Well, you've got a lot of different names that he goes by in Scripture. The one that is really the main one, the most important one, is his covenant name, Yahweh. And this was something that was considered so holy that after a time, the Jews would not pronounce it for fear of using it. I say
and still don't
profanely.
today, right?
What I mean is,
they still don't do it today, right?
Right.
Okay.
And yeah, still don't. In fact,
Right.
I had a couple of different professors who went to school at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, which is a Jewish school, has always been a Jewish school. Many of them, when they run across the name Yahweh in the Old Testament, will say Adonai, because that's what their professors did. Adonai means Lord. And so they would substitute that name for the name Yahweh to make sure that they did not use God's name in vain. And what they mean by that is basically anytime you use it with less respect than it deserves, you're using it in vain, not just, saying a curse word with God's name in it or using his name as a curse word, as some people do with Jesus. But using it at any time when it's not, basically using it like any other word in the dictionary. I would say it's kind of my rule for using God's name in vain. But extremely, extremely important, and that's what it is. And you can identify it in the biblical text, because most translations, at least most modern ones, will have Lord as with a capital L, small or capital O-R-D. That's the name Yahweh. I would say pretty much all the time in the Old Testament.
Okay. I'm glad you made that point, because I think sometimes we tend to think when we look at this that he's just talking about profanity. And so people will say, well, as long as I'm not doing that, as long as I'm keeping it separate from those curse words or whatever, whatever foul language is in vogue at the time, as long as I keep it separate from that, that's what it's asking of me here. But you're making the point that it's a deeper thing than that. And so I think about the word vanity, and vanity means, if you say, that Dewayne Bryant, he's so vain, that means that you just worry about the outside and there's really no substance on the inside. You're not worried about the inside. And so same sort of thing would be applied with the vanity of using God's name in that way, because it has no substance behind it, no depth or no meaning or no respect or any of those kinds of things. And I think there's a third thing in here, and I was going to kind of get your opinion on a little bit, is that sometimes we do evil things and invoke God's name in the process. So think of it like this, because the Hebrew word there does mean emptiness, but it also has a secondary meaning of a falsehood, using it in a false way. And so when we commit evil that reflects badly upon us, we've talked about that, and it carries down our children. When we commit evil in God's name, it tends to be more powerful. And so you think about all the things in history. I mean, atheists are still using examples like the Crusades and the Spanish Inquisition and things like that of the wickedness of man that is done in God's name. And they still try, that's still one of their key arguments that they'll use talking about it. And so we've got to be careful as we go out and we behave and we preach and we teach and we speak and we do it as the oracles of God in God's name, that we do it the right way.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? And that whatever actions that we put out there that we're going to attach the name of God to, they had better be godly actions. You know what I'm saying? And so again, I think there's an added into that a lesson for me to be very careful about, as a preacher, what I say. Well, God says this, and God believes that, and God, I had better be sure that God actually says and believes that if I'm going
Hmm.
to attach His name to it. Okay.
Yeah.
Then we have in Exodus 20 verses 8 through 11. He has the reminders about the Sabbath day. He said, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh uh, day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heavens and earth and sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." Um, so with that in mind, he's telling him, remember the Sabbath day, but it's more than just, hey, remember this. Like my wife would say, hey, remember when you go to the store, pick up extra eggs or something like that. They had just learned about the Sabbath. Manna is going to be distributed with the Sabbath sort of model in mind. Remember, they can't go out and collect it on the Sabbath. They had to collect more the day before. More than likely, what he's telling us: never forget the Sabbath. In other words, always be mindful of it. Always uh, be practicing it in their Jewish faith. And he tells them to keep it holy. And holiness is a separation. Holy vessels were those who were separated for non-common uses. They were used to serve just God. Um, and so when you look at the Sabbath, it's more than just a prohibition on work. Um, it was a command to keep it different than all the other days. It's there's something to be different about it. Now, he does tell them, don't work, do no work. Um, and again, work is good. Um, God expects us to be industrious. He expects us to be working and laboring, um, but not at the expense of our relationship with Him. Um, and and the reality is, we can get lost in work if we're not careful. Work is such a big part of our lives. If we're not careful, we can get wrapped up in it and we can forget. I mean, when you think about work, it gives us purpose and definition. It provides for us. I mean, the other day, of course, we're hearing the coronavirus stuff, so I had to go to HEB, and I was going to pick up a few things, and our HEB opens at 8, and so you have to get in line. Well, if you get there, you have to get there like an hour early, Dwayne. To the first time I went, I didn't. I got there about 20 minutes before it opened, and this is a big HEB Plus. It's a huge store, right? The line went all the way across the front, down the side, all the way about halfway down the back, and then turned around and was coming the other way before it opened. So I was in the back of the store when the day started. That's how long that line was. So I went a little earlier this time. And of course, if you're going to go a little early, you got to sit there. And of course, I'm sitting there and waiting, and the guy behind me, we start talking, and one of the most natural questions to ask him is, "Hey, what do you do?" And he ended up being an engineer working on the bridge project that's going on here in Corpus, and of course, he asked me what I did, and I told him, and so we started that conversation. But that's a very natural. What do you do to help me understand who you are and what defines you and that kind of thing? Um, and so again, we take a lot of identity by what we do and our work that we provide. But the danger is what we do is not who we are. Um, all of those things that we talked about, our purpose, what defines us, what provides for us, all of those questions are answered in God, not work.
Mm.
My purpose and my definition and my providing all source from God. And I don't want to forget that, and God didn't want His people to forget that. And so, um, again, as important as work is, God is more important. And again, I think there's also a sense in which it's a reminder of their freedoms, because slaves didn't get to take a day off. If you got to take a day off, that was a special thing, right? That you couldn't. And I'm going to go out on a limb here. Again, I'm going to maybe defer to the expert, but as a slave in this time, excuse me, you couldn't say, "Hey, boss, I'd like to take the day off today," and the master go, "Yeah, that's fine. Do what you got to do." They weren't given that freedom, were they?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure they got vacation days.
Right.
Right here.
Well,
I don't think that was part of their work contract.
then you get to come and go, "Hey, taskmaster, I'm going to take a personal day today. I just got to work on me." That wasn't allowed.
Yeah, I need some self-care. Yeah, no.
Right. So it did remind them of that, though. It did remind them, you're not a slave. You cease from labor. You have the opportunity to do that and to set this time aside. And there was an interesting thing in here that I saw that I didn't really, I don't know that I've ever really considered it, but I thought it was a great point. Was he mentions all of those who are not supposed to work, and he says you, your sons, your daughters, and then he says your manservants and your female servants and your cattle, and then your honored guests. And when you look at the society of the day, those didn't all stand on equal footing. You know, I mean, you think about the prodigal son. He said, "Listen, I can't go back as a son, but maybe I'll go back as a servant." And God and the father, which again is God in the story, the father would treat me like a servant, and that's good enough. And then he comes back and he gives him, he restores to him the fullness of what it means to be a son. And so they didn't stand on equal footing, but yet in this commandment they do. All of you cease from labor. And maybe it reminds us of the humanity of slaves and servants at the time, and it reminded them of that humanity. These are people too, and they have a relationship with me that they need to focus on, and all that kind of thing. And again, there's also a sense in which I think when you look at it, make sure I'm on the right page. Not only does it talk about their intrinsic value as people, but there is, and we're about to wrap up here, and I'll let you have some of the final words here. The Sabbath is a public affirmation of your belief that God created the world. When you look at the way the text is worded, why is this important? Because I created the world, and on the seventh day I rested. And so it's connected to that principle of creation. God makes that connection for it. And I think there's an object lesson of sorts. When the world moves on and they keep working, those of us let me put this differently, those who believed in that day that God was the creator, honored that creation by resting as he did. And so observing the Sabbath is making a statement. It's not only practical, and that you can't work 7 days a week constantly and you need some time to recuperate, but there was also some theological ramifications to it. It was a statement of ways. This is my devotion to a God that I believe created the universe by mimicking that in my life. Anyway, so I'm gonna kick it to you, man. Do you think I'm far off? What do you think about that?
No, in fact, I mentioned, for our folks this past Sunday that when you look at God, we have a lot of the same attributes that he has, but then again, we also have a lot of the same tasks and activities that he has. And so, I made I was trying to give our folks a little bit of encouragement to say, you look at Scripture, God's an architect, he's a creator. In a sense, we kind of follow along with that. He's also an artist. We participate in that as well. He's a physician. We talk about Jesus as the great physician. Yeah, we have physicians also. And so with the Sabbath, we kind of follow along in God's footsteps. And by resting and taking this time to focus on spiritual matters and taking care of self, there's a sense in which we're doing exactly what God did. And so by being Christians, by being God's people, we follow along in his footsteps and do a lot of the same things that he is and he does. And that's just one of those things that we do that kind of connects us with him.
Right. All right, man. So we're going to have to call it here. And we'll get to the rest of them. Like I said, the second part of this is really man's relationship with one another. How do you treat one another? Because of this relationship that you have with God. The relationship with God has to come first. If we don't have that relationship with God, we're not going to treat each other the way that we should. And so the relationship with God must come first. But there are some practical applications to that in the way that we deal with one another. And we'll talk about that next week. We'll have that for class next week. Again, I'm fighting the urge, Dewayne, to sign off saying, live your life unashamed, because that's how so many of these conversations went when we were doing the podcast. And I'm not going to ask you for your shameless plug of the week or anything like that. Just to tell you, man, I appreciate you. And I see a lot of posts where folks are talking about wanting to get back together as congregations, and I certainly share those sentiments. We were praying for that. And so people are just like, we just want to get back to normal. But I will say this. I have seen the church out in the open more in the last 2 weeks than I think I have in my life. You can't get on Facebook without seeing one of these videos of somebody sitting down and studying through God's word, and you look at all the views that people have. And I know there's online seminars that are going on, and things like that. And so the gospel is being shared, God's word is being shared and taught. It's being broadcast out there for not only for Christians, but other people to see. And as much as I like to go back to the old ways, I hope some of these good things stay. And I hope the caring for one another and the concern for one another as Christians, and the sharing of the gospel and the sharing of God's word, I hope that stays with us, even as we get back together and are able to assemble once again, as we're used to. So that's all I've got for this week. Dewayne, you got anything else you want to add, or you ready to wrap this baby up?
Hey, man, I'm just appreciate the opportunity to be here and study something that's really is, to me, it's an exciting thing to get to look at this. So I appreciate the opportunity. All
right, man. Again, I almost went into the podcast ending. We're going to call it at that. Odom, Church of Christ, thank you guys. And again, we were praying for you. We'll see you, and we'll be praying for the New York Avenue Church of Christ, and ask that they do the same for us, and pray for all our brethren out there. So until next week, guys, stay safe, be good, and we'll get through this together. Bye.